All right, good afternoon. This is Bonnie McFarland, and I'm here with part of our team, Rachel Garcia, Adrian Balcazar, and Amy Tomomatsu. And you'll be hearing from all of them this afternoon as we take a look at equitable services requirements. And you may say, we've been talking about equitable services, seems like for a year now, but this we're going to focus in on the basics of ESEA, primarily ESEA equitable services requirements. We do this once a year, about this time of year. Okay. Sounds like the doorbell stopped. And so we're going to review again basic requirements for services to eligible.
Sorry, the doorbell thing. I don't know how to turn it off.
Oh, okay. I thought it was like, wow, we got to crowd the door. I'm not sure.
Somebody knows, you can write it in the chat. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's trick or treaters, it sounds like. Anyway, all right, we'll get there. So anyway, just to let you know right up front, this requirement only applies to school districts, okay, because the requirements are based on district boundaries. And so since charter schools don't have any district boundaries, the requirements don't apply. So if you're a charter school, doesn't apply to you, so you get the afternoon to do something else if you're a charter school, because you won't have to address these requirements. So just don't ring the bell on the way out, okay? All right, so let's take a look. We're going to add your questions. We're going to ask you, as usual, to put your questions in that, and we'll respond to them. Sometimes these questions can be rather complex, especially on this area, and the kind of questions that you sometimes ask are very specific. So we will get back to you with an FAQ on them. So what we're going to look at today, we're going to focus on the district role and responsibilities for equitable services and for designing, implementing, and evaluating services for private school participants. So the district has a significant role here, and we're going to spend some time focusing on that role and what your role is. Another area we're going to look at is how to determine the proportional share for ESEA program services to private school participants. This varies by program, so it can be a little bit confusing. So we're going to look at each program and how those amounts are determined. Another important part of equitable services is consultation, and consultation is a critical piece. So we're going to spend some time looking at the consultation section. And then before we leave, we'll give you an idea of where you can find some resources to support your work with private schools. So on the next slide, we'll look at one of those resources. And I laugh because usually it's dogs that we're worried about that make the noises in the background. So this is a change. It's not woof woof, ding ding. All right. So one resource we have for you is a handbook, and it's called Implementing Equitable Services. Some of you may already have it, but we've updated it a bit this year. And it provides basic information applicable to all federal programs. So there's some generic pieces, and then it includes some common information, common definition, and fiscal requirements that cross programs. Okay, so there are some commonalities. It also includes the requirements from the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, known as EDGAR. So there are some specific requirements there that are addressed, and they're listed, but they're also spelled out in the steps to developing programs. And then it also reviews the consultation process, requirements, and it includes separate sections for each program. So there's a general section about general requirements, and then there's one for each program. It also includes a flash drive that has some materials that would be helpful for you in terms of your consultation process that you can copy. So you'll find ordering information on the website if you want to, if you're interested in ordering it, or if you already have a copy, you might dust it off and be able to use it. All right, so we always start with on this the historical context, and because people often wonder how did this get started, and why are there so many confusions and challenges, and a lot of it lies in the whole history of how equitable services requirements came to be. And as you hear it, you'll start hearing little echoes of, oh yes, I ran into a problem related to that, or this explains why that's challenging. First of all, the question becomes, why are we providing equitable services to private schools? Why is that public school? These are public school funds. Why is this a part of the requirement? And it goes all the way back to 1965. 1965, when the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was first established, it almost ran into a roadblock because of a disagreement between teachers unions and the private schools sector, in terms of private schools, particularly with the Archdiocese and the Catholic schools, who had a lot of private schools. And this teachers unions were saying, no, we don't think the money we shouldn't be sending money to private schools, and we'll block this law if that happens. And the private school sector said, we'll block this law if we don't have funds in there for private schools. So it got to be a sort of a standoff. This was important. This was President Johnson's a key piece of his War on Poverty program, and he was not going to let it go. So he had a Secretary of Education. His name was Keppel, and he came up with something called the Keppel's Compromise. And that's what we're living with today. Keppel's Compromise resulted in funds not going to private schools. So as you know, you can't send funding to directly private schools, but services go to private schools. So the district ended up with this role of overseeing those services. So that was the compromise that actually got the Elementary and Secondary Education Act passed. So that's how it came to be in the beginning. And almost immediately it ran into challenges, and you can see a number of court cases that followed that. And the first one they call the Lemon Test. You can see that's in 1971, shortly after the law was enacted. And the Lemon Test was from a case, Lemon versus Kurtzman, and it addressed questions that were some of the first questions asked, and that was about the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause of the Constitution says that Congress shall not, that they can't establish a religion, and there was a concern that this was that providing federal funds and supporting private school services, particularly in those that were in church-oriented or religiously oriented schools, was infringing on the Establishment Clause. And so what they call the Lemon Test came up with the test that the services had to be secular, and they could not advance religion or inhibit religion. So the public sector could not be involved in doing anything in terms of providing services that advanced religion, like providing religious instruction, or inhibiting religion. So that was the balance. And then the issue of entanglement came up and said there should be no entanglement between the government in the form of the public school and the religious organizations in the form of the private school. So that sort of set the stage until 1985, and a decision in Grand Rapids, Michigan School District versus Vaughn. And in that case, they determined this was not a particular Title I federal program, but it was a district program that put teachers into that put teachers, textbooks, supported services in private schools. So the state actually was supporting private schools, and the decision was that didn't meet the entanglement test. So they had a shared time program, and it was a community-based program, and they included public and private schools, and teachers went out to those schools, and they said, no, that didn't meet the entanglement test. The same year was a well-known case, Aguilar versus Felton. And in the Aguilar versus Felton case, this was a New York City Title I program, and New York schools put teachers into the private schools, and they had supervisors out there supervising the services. And the Aguilar versus Felton decision said that was excessive entanglement, and because you had supervisors, you had teachers right in the private schools. So the decision in Aguilar was, no, that's not allowed because that doesn't meet the entanglement test. there's too close, the relationship is too close between the public and private schools. So some people still have remnants of this hanging around. Separate buildings, mobile units were developed. So kids from private schools were going off the private school site to go get services. So it essentially prohibited public school teachers from providing services on private school sites. That was in place until 1997. So we had about 10 years in which a lot of districts spent a lot of money on mobile units and temporary buildings. 1997, Agostini versus Felton, one of the same litigants, came back. And in that case, they reversed the Aguilar decision and said, no, that wasn't excessive entanglement, as long as there were safeguards in place. And so teachers could go back onto, it was only entanglement if it was excessive. And they found that in this case, it wasn't excessive. Same program that 10 years before was excessive and was prohibited, now was not. So suddenly districts had all these buildings and mobile units they'd purchased, and they didn't have to use them. After that, there were we didn't see as many court cases after that, but concerns started coming about consultation. And that had to do with, so school districts were they'd gone back and forth. That's why we have the ping pong here. And the concerns were that school districts were just offering services to private schools. They weren't really consulting, and the law said you must consult. And instead, they found a lot of school districts were saying, here's our program, take it or leave it. You can come to our professional development program or not. And so that became an area of concern, and we saw a lot of monitoring and discussion about that and concerns raised. In 2010, U.S. Department of Education did a review of California's equitable services programs. So they came to California and did a review of the state. And these are some of the findings they found, and you'll see some of these in the work you're doing now. One was public control of the program. They saw, on the other hand, instead of in response to the concerns about consultation, districts are now sort of saying, do whatever you want. Here's the money, go do what you want. And they weren't controlling the design, the development, the oversight of the program. So again, we swung from one extreme to another. Next, they were concerned about equitable share, that districts were not determining the equitable share appropriately. They found that programs were benefiting the private school. And as you know, programs can't benefit the private school. They're for the benefit of students in the private school, but they can't benefit the private school itself. And the other one they found was that selection criteria, particularly for Title I students, were not being selected appropriately based on the required criteria. So those were some issues that came out of that, and we saw some responses from a California Department of Education based on that. Finally, in 2015, we had the Every Student Succeeds Act, and it made some changes, and we'll take a look at those in just a minute. But essentially, two of the biggies, they changed the Title I funding formula, and they added the state ombudsman. So let's take a closer look at those, an overview of some of those changes under ESEA. So here you can see the ombudsman was added, and that was supposed to be a position that was sort of a mediator between the public and private schools. And really the ombudsman's job is to see that equitable services are provided appropriately. Oops. And the second was the submission of consultation documentation. So ESEA requires that districts submit to the State Department information regarding their consultation. So they need to confirm that they actually did, and they have to show documentation. In California, that's done through the consolidated application. Another area was the use of funds in the current year carryover issues under NCLB. The determination about carryover was essentially, whose fault was it that the funds didn't get spent? Was it that the district didn't implement the program in time, or was it that you were not getting responses from the private school? That changed under ESEA, and they made it very clear funds are required to be spent in the current year. We've since had some guidance on that, and we'll take a look at that later, but that was a shift under ESEA. State notification of funding. The state's required to notify private schools of funding available at districts, and you can see that's posted on the CDE Ombudsman's webpage. The Title I allocation formula changed significantly to take it off the top, and that's been something to get used to in the last few years. And then some changes on consultation regarding pooling of funds, coordinating funding, and also changes in the affirmation process requiring an opportunity for private schools to say no, the consultation was not timely and meaningful. So we'll take a look at all of these in a little more depth later, but those are some of the key changes that happened in 2015 under ESEA. And on the next slide, we'll see the email and contact for our CDE Ombudsman. It's Sylvia Hanna. Some of you might have worked with Sylvia, asked her questions. Great to pass questions by her if you think there's a problem or a dispute between your district and a private school on how they view something. Great person to check with and get Sylvia's input on that. So that's her job, is to ensure that equitable services are provided, but she's also a great support for districts with questions on technical kinds of things. So what are equitable services? Well, as you can see, it's a district program. It's not a private school program. It's a district program provided to students, teachers, and in some cases parents in eligible participating nonprofit private schools. So notice they're only nonprofit private schools, and they're from federal education funds only. So there are no state programs that have an equitable services requirement, only certain federal funds. And we'll see those on the next slide. And those funds include Title I, both Part A and C. Part C is migrant education. Title I, Part A is your basic Title I formula. And if you receive migrant funds, and we had a question this year from a district that does have migrant funds, and so they were asking about how those funds are allocated. Title II, III, and IV, Part A, those are your regular formula grant funds. They also have an equitable services requirement, but also is Title IV, Part B, which is your 21st century school programs that are competitive in nature, but there is a requirement that private schools be a part of the development of those programs and consulted if they wish to participate in those programs. So as we said, it's about the program, okay? And it's what is the program in a private school, and it's about what the program is really in the public school. So what's a Title I program? Well, a Title I program is about improving academic achievement. So that's what Title I is about, identifying low achieving students in your private schools that are eligible and providing academic support for those students. Title II has to do with primarily professional development. And so Title II is about primarily professional development services. Title III is supplemental Title III program being provided to English learners and immigrant students. So you receive EL, Title III EL, then you're required to offer those services. If you receive immigrant funds, you're also required to provide services under those programs. And keep in mind, Title III has that additional supplemental requirement that it's supposed to supplement state, local, and federal funds. And then finally, Title IV is those three areas: well-rounded education, conditions for student learning, and effective use of technology. And so that's what the program should be designed for in those areas. Title I is different from the other programs. And so we'll be spending more time on Title I today. Primarily, Title I is significantly different in how the funding is provided and how services are provided. And this is mainly because Title I is a school level program. Title II, III, and IV are all district level programs. So that's why they're similar in the way service offered and funding is determined. But Title I is a school level program. So funding and services are based on the student's residence rather than where the school is is located. So as a result, you may need to serve students outside your district boundaries for Title I, and we'll spend more time looking at that later. But Title II, III, and IV, you're only responsible for students in the district boundaries. All right, next slide. We're just going to spend a minute on what we've been talking about for the last year, right? The additional federal funding that came under CARES Act, and now the new coronavirus response and relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. So let's take just a quick look at those, because we're not going to spend a lot of time on those for a couple reasons. We're separating last year's CARES Act from the more recent, what they're calling CARISA funds, because there are significant differences with regard to private schools. So you may have remaining CARES Act funds, and that's because of the confusion and conflicting guidance we had last year that caused a lot of LEAs to delay services waiting for clarification regarding the requirements. So first, ESSER funds went directly to LEAs, and those funds included in the CARES Act, they included an equitable services requirement. In addition, GEAR funds were state level funds. They went to the state, but they were allocated in California through the learning loss mitigation funds. So only the GEAR funds in those learning loss mitigation funds were included in equitable services requirement. So that was where the CARES Act fund. The confusion about this, as you know, came between the difference in what the law said and what the guidance said from the U.S. Department, and the law indicating that services and funding under the CARES Act were to be provided in the same manner as Title I. However, U.S. Department guidance initially said it should be based on all students rather than low-income students. This went through several court cases and was finally determined that it is about determining funding is based on low-income students. That didn't get resolved until early last fall. So now we have new coronavirus relief supplement. That's not the one that was just passed. It was one that was passed in December. And those funds will be coming. The difference is that these include also the same thing. They're calling them ESSER 2 and GEAR 2. So they have those same two funding sources. ESSER will be allocated similarly to ESSER 1 school level. GEAR will be a state level. And we don't know, but possibly go into learning loss mitigation again. However, the big difference in terms of our conversation today is that this law included a separate appropriation called the Emergency Aid for Non-Public Schools. And these are separate funds administered by the State Education Agency, which is CDE in our case. So districts have no responsibility to provide equitable services under the new CARISA funds. So if you didn't spend the funds last year under the CARES Act, those need to be continued for equitable services as described under CARES. But the new funding, that will be the state's responsibility to ensure services go to non-public schools, and no requirement for districts. So hopefully that's some good news for today. Also, if you have remaining CARES Equitable Share on the next slide, we'll just take a look at the timelines. You have through September 30th, 2022 for those CARES Act funds to spend them. However, they should be expended for private schools as soon as possible. And as we said, it's been clarified, these are for low-income students residing in Title I school attendance area. That's how funding is determined. The CARES Act includes, again, that district control of funds that you're familiar with under ESSA, or you will be familiar with after the end of this session. And so CARES Act funds mean that they are under the control of the district. And that means that any items have to be ordered through the district. That private schools cannot, they can never order their own materials. Equipment is on the district inventory and labeled with district identification and monitored. Districts cannot reimburse private schools for expenses, and funds must be used for allowable costs under ESSER and GEAR. So hopefully those funds are now clear and moving it, and for the new funding that is on the state to work with. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move on to, I think it's Adrian.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to take a look at Equitable Share. And so if we look at the next slide, we will see that under ESEA, Equitable Share ensures the equitable participation of private school students, teachers, and families. And services are considered to be equitable when the district meets the expenditure requirements of a federal program. The district must provide a program that meets the educational needs of the participants, and it must be equitable in comparison to the services and other benefits that is provided for the public school students. So you're going to see equitable services, equitable share, and so, but it's all about being equal. So let's take a deeper dive into Title I. As Bonnie mentioned, it is definitely different in terms of the methodologies and the usage, and because it is a school level program. So under ESEA, we know that equitable services for the private schools are based on equitable share. This can be explained that when the district is determining the expenditures for educational services and other benefits to the eligible private school students, it must be equal to the proportion of funds allocated to the participating school attendance areas. And this is based on the number of children from the low income families who attend the private schools. So the funding is determined in a specific method. So how is the funding determined? There are specific methods that must be followed in determining the proportional share of funding. The method for determining the proportional share is different depending on the program. So the methodology for Title I is significantly different and oftentimes confusing from the other federal programs, because for Title I, it is based on the students' residence, just as Bonnie mentioned before. And the other programs are different. It has to do with the school within the district boundaries. So here are some key points about the Title I funding for equitable services. First of all, the proportional share must be calculated on the total amount of what the district receives for the Title I allocation. And it must be taken off the top, set aside for equitable services. The funds must be used to implement the Title I program in the same fiscal year that the district receives them. And you can always have you can look at your Con app for that confirmation of the dollar amount. And as was stated earlier, the state has that new responsibility to notify the private schools of the allocation of funds that the district has determined for equitable share, and that is on the Ombudsman's website. So specifically for Title I, to determine the Title I proportional share of funds, the school or you as a district have to identify the private school students that are going to be generating the funds. You're going to have to know who are the low-income families in the eligible private schools within your district and the adjoining districts. Next, you're going to need to consult with the private school to determine what measure of poverty are you going to be using. And you do have some choices. There are basically 4 choices. You can use the same measure of low income that's used to count public school children in the same as the district, and that typically is a preferred method. You can also use comparable data. So you can use the results of a survey, typically known as a poverty survey. And just a note that if you do use a survey, you will want to the extent possible, protect the identity of the families. Sometimes this can be tricky because parents don't want to fill it out because they don't know where the information is going to go to. So you want to also, make sure that there is, to the extent possible to protect the identity. You also you're going to need to allow the data. You can extrapolate it and use the actual data if you can't get actual data. You're going to have to kind of work around that. So, but again, it's it's another way of attaining that low poverty family information. The third way is to use proportionality. This is a little tricky, but you can do that. And this is here you would apply the low income percentage of each participating Title I public school attendance area, and which is determined pursuant to this section to the number of private school students who reside in that school attendance area. So there's an actual method of doing that mathematically. And last, you can use an equated measure of low income that correlates with the measure of low income used to count public school children. So again, there are these ways to determine the way you're going to collect that poverty information. And then once you have determined that and you've agreed on what measure of poverty you're going to be using, now you need to collect it, or the school needs to collect it, and you need to work with the private school on this. And then the poverty data will need to be filtered in order to collect the number of students that qualify ages 5 through 17 who are from low-income families and attend the eligible private schools. So in determining the actual proportion of shares, once you have the actual number of students, now you can determine how much money is going to be generated for the private school students. So first, you're going to need to find the proportional percentage rate. And to do this, you're going to have to divide the number of low-income private school students divided by the total number of public and private school students. And so once you do that mathematically, you will get a proportional percentage rate. Then you will take that proportional percentage rate and you will multiply that rate times the allocation, the total amount that your Title I Part A entitlement is. And that will give you the total proportional share that will be available for services to your eligible students in the participating private schools. And so once you have that, you will need to consult with individual private schools to determine the needs and services that will be provided. And also, if you find that in this consultation, a need to discuss the option of pooling or coordinating with other funds, it's done at this time once you have figured out that proportional share. If you look at this, the Con app, as you have filled it out this this last month, here's a screenshot of the Private School Equitable Services Reservation page from the Con app. And this shows you what it looks like. The arrow is pointing to the field where the sum of the public and non-private school low-income student data is inputted, and then it will calculate the percentage rate for you. The next part of this page is the allocation. So here you will see how the percentage rate is calculated and multiplied times the allocation, and it will give you the proportional share. It will calculate that for you. So now that you have the dollar amount, you have the funds, now it's time to put into practice the services. So when you are providing the Title I services, there are certain things and mandates that you must follow. It must be based on needs assessment, and there must be consultation within that. Also, your Title I program is run using the Targeted Assistance School model, the TAS model. And if you're hiring your own district employees to provide the Title I services, they must meet the state credential requirements. And then to implement your Title I program, you need to implement the program. You're not allowed to just provide materials and supplies. That's not a program. And so you want to make sure that you are providing that. And then also in identifying the services, you have to remember that, again, if they must reside in the Title I attendance area, there must be multiple educational related objective criteria that is agreed during the consultation. And there are some students that are automatically eligible, and that is the homeless students and the students in Head Start Even Start, Pre-K, Migrant Program. If the students are in a local institution for neglected or delinquent children, or youth attending a community day program. And so for such children in the last 2 years. And remember, when you're identifying who receives services, it's poverty for Title I. Poverty is not a criteria for services. It is a measure of generating funds, but who receives the services are the students that are participating in the nonprofit schools identified by the LEA as failing or at risk of failing, and they reside in the school attendance area. So I think my notes are switched. So I think I covered this first and then I just finished the other. So now moving on. So let's take a look at, with Title I, as we said, how the money is generated is based on the poverty of the families of those students that are in your attendance area. That you know, if they're able to get this money. So what we have here is a graphic that shows a district that perhaps this pertains to. If you have a district, your district has Title I schools and non-Title I schools. And so here we see in the blue, this district has Title I schools and non-Title I schools within its district boundaries. So then now let's look at the private schools. You can see here in this diagram that private schools whose physical location is within your district boundaries. And then in the green, you can see the other private schools adjoining or surrounding the district. And then we see there are 6 low poverty students identified 1 through 3 that live in the attendance area of the school that is a Title I school. And then we have students numbers 4 through 6 that live in the attendance area of the school that is not a Title I school. So now you see this. Now we're going to take a look at what this all means and how this all plays out. So if we look at the low poverty students, numbers 1, 2, and 3, all 3 students live in a Title I school attendance area. So because they live in a Title I school attendance area, all 3 of these low poverty students would generate Title I funding, no matter which private school they attend. Remember that where the student resides for Title I is what determines whether they generate funding for the private school. Now let's look on the right side, and we see low poverty students numbers 4, 5, and 6, and they all live in a non-Title I school attendance area. All 3 of these low poverty students would not generate any funding for the private school because where they live is in the attendance area of a non-Title I school. So additionally, you can see at the bottom for surrounding District C, you can see that they have students from both areas. So that kind of complicates things. So again, trying to keep Title I and the low poverty and students and all this information is very complicated, and it can become quite confusing especially if you have people helping you, clerical, that are kind of filtering through the poverty data. It's really important that the addresses of the students are clear, because the identification of where the students live is paramount in determining who generates funding. And especially if you have your district that has both types of Title I schools and non-Title I schools. So here's a little test. Who generates the funding and who receives the services? So we have here 3 students. So the first student is low income, lives in the Title I school attendance area, is high achieving. So the question is, would this student generate funding? Well, low income in a Title I school attendance, yes. Would they be receiving services? No, because again, it's for the at risk of failing or most at risk of failing, as defined in ESEA and also in the Code of Federal Regulations. If we look at student 2, this student is a low-income student that does not live in a Title I school attendance area, but is low achieving. So do they generate funding? No. And will they be receiving services? No. And this is because if they were to live in the attendance area of the school that they would belong in, that school is non-Title I, so they would not be receiving Title I services at that time. So now we look at student number 3, and this student is a high-income student that lives in a Title I school attendance area, but is low achieving. So do they generate funding? Oh, that is, and the answer is no. I'm sorry, no, they're high income. They would not generate funding. And would they be receiving services? Yes, because they live in a Title I attendance area and they are low achieving. So they would be receiving the services. There's also, if you look on the CONAP, the last portion, the bottom portion of the CONAP page has the parent engagement. And this is not only taken from the CONAP, but also the CDE FAQs. And what it says is that in regards to parent engagement, if you're a district that receives over $500,000 or $500,000 or more, you have a legal obligation to reserve at least 1% of the Title I for your district. So you would have to also reserve an equal percentage from the Equitable Services Proportional Share in order to carry out your parent and family engagement activities at that participating nonprofit private school for those students and families. But the FAQs also say that if your district receives less than $500,000, then you may reserve funds from the Title I Part A Equitable Services Proportional Share, so that you can carry out any particular parent and family engagement activities at that school for those participating private school students. So, you know, if you receive 500,000 or more, you must reserve that that equitable share, that proportional share. And if you are under, you may, you know, again, based on consultation, your past practice, and you know, sometimes, you know, helping out the families there. So Title I, like I said, is very, very different in how the money is generated, the funds are generated, and how the services are provided for those at failing or at most at risk of failing in their academic areas of generally math and English language arts. And so now Rachel is going to continue explaining Equitable Share, but with the other programs of Title I, or 2, 3, and 4.
Thank you, Adrienne. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Adrienne mentioned, we will now take a look at Equitable Share for Titles 2, 3, and 4. Next slide, please. So these titles are different from Title I because with Titles 2, 3, and 4, only nonprofit private schools within your district boundaries are eligible to participate. So there is no requirement to contact private schools outside of your district boundaries for these programs as you would do for Title I. Next slide, please. Here's a graphic that illustrates which private schools will be served by your district for Titles 2, 3, and 4. So in this scenario, your district is in the blue area, and you have districts A, B, and C surrounding you in the green area. There are also private schools all around. So which private schools would you need to reach out to? Well, you would reach out to the private schools within your district boundaries. So that would be private schools 1 and 2 in this example. For Titles 2 and 4, you would determine an equitable share based on the total enrollment at the private school. For Title 3, you would determine the equitable share based on the number of English learners and/or immigrant students at the private school. And again, you would not need to serve any of the private schools outside of your district boundaries when it comes to Titles 2, 3, and 4. This is in contrast to Title I because, as Adrienne explained, with Title I, you reach out to private schools in surrounding districts because the services follow the students who reside in your district's Title I attendance areas, but may be attending schools outside of your district boundaries. Next slide, please. So now for a few slides on each of these titles. For Title II Equitable Services, a per pupil amount is determined based on the LEA's total Title II allocation, less the administrative cost, and the total enrollment of all public and nonprofit private school students at participating nonprofit private schools. The district may use Title II Part A funds to provide professional development activities for private school teachers, principals, and other school personnel to address the specific needs of the private school students. Additionally, there might be other permissible uses of Title II Part A funds for the benefit of private school students and staff, as long as they are services that are based on Title II allowable cost. One thing to remember is that the services for Title II are determined through consultation, and again, based on the specific needs of the students enrolled in the private school. The scenario to avoid is one in which the private school requests reimbursement for a conference that they already attended, or requests late registration for an upcoming conference that was not one that you had both discussed in prior consultation, nor was determined to meet the specified needs. The plan for Title II equitable services should be intentionally planned in advance. We've also included the link to the CDE's Title II Equitable Services webpage, which includes additional resources, including directions on how to calculate the Title II proportional share, and also some frequently asked questions. Next slide, please. Title III Part A has two parts, the Title III English Learner Program and the Title III Immigrant Program. And the proportional share is calculated based on the per pupil allocations for the EL and/or immigrant students enrolled in both public and participating nonprofit private schools. So for the English Learner Program, the private school would administer the home language survey to the students being considered for participation. And this should be the same version as the home language survey that is used by the district. If a language other than English is indicated on the home language survey, then the district is required to administer an initial language assessment. And the district cannot use the LPAC with private school students. On the next slide, we reference some of the approved assessments for this purpose. Actually, if you could go back to the previous slide. So the district is responsible for the cost and oversight of the initial assessment. And EL students at the private school must also be assessed annually to determine continued eligibility. In consultation, the district and each private school will develop a memorandum of understanding that at a minimum describes the services and products to be provided, the estimated cost, and the dates of their provision. Private schools may also be eligible to participate in the Title III Immigrant Program if the private school submitted the Student National Origin Report, also known as the SNOR, with the number of eligible immigrant students, and it is also located within the boundaries of an LEA that is eligible for and receives funding. Private schools submit the SNOR directly to the CDE via an online reporting system. And just as a side note, the count of immigrant students in districts is reported in CalPADS, not the SNOR. So in consultation, a private school with eligible immigrant students choosing to participate in the Title III Immigrant Program will also develop an MOU with the district. And at the bottom of the slide, we've also included some links to some CDE web pages for additional information regarding Title III EL and immigrant programs, and also the SNOR. And these links include resources such as a sample MOU and also frequently asked questions. Next slide, please. So this is the list of approved Title III English Learner Assessments for private school students to assess English language proficiency. And as previously mentioned, the LPAC may not be administered to private school students. These are the tests that were previously approved to use. However, any test which is reliable and valid for assessing English proficiency in English learners and also mutually agreed upon through consultation may be used. And so just keep in mind that any test selected must also have technical data supporting its validity and reliability to measure listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills in English proficiency. Next slide, please. So ESEA requires providing activities that supplement or enhance language instruction for English learners. And this also includes providing professional development for teachers of English learners and also providing parent and family engagement activities. The MOU developed by the district and private school in consultation should address these services that are agreed upon to supplement or enhance language instruction. The MOU should also address how the student's needs will be identified and how the services will be assessed to improve the program. Next slide, please. One last note on Title III is that the LEA is paid in arrears, or in other words, reimbursed for its services to private school students. The CDE collects data in the CONAP on the number of nonprofit, private school, EL, and immigrant students served in the current year, and then adds this number to the public school count when calculating the following year's award amount in order to reimburse districts for the services provided. Next slide, please. For Title IV, Part A, Equitable Share, districts will determine a per pupil amount based on the district's total Title IV allocation, less administrative costs, and the total enrollment of both public and nonprofit private school students. And so this is the same way that Equitable Share is determined for Title II. So the purpose of Title IV Part A is to provide students access to well-rounded educational opportunities, improve school conditions for student learning, and improve the use of technology to improve academic achievement and digital literacy of all students. Private school services may focus on one or more of these areas. However, this must also be determined through consultation with private school officials, and it must also be based on student needs. It's also important to note that the percentage requirements that apply to each of the Title IV program areas for districts that receive over $30,000 in Title IV funds does not apply to private schools. So the percentage requirements only apply at the overall district level. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see the link to the CDE Title IV webpage, and this page includes additional information and resources, including examples of activities for each of the 3 Title IV program areas. Next slide, please. So here we see some screenshots from the CDE's method of calculating equitable services proportional share documents for Titles 2, 3, and 4. And these documents walk you through the process of determining equitable share for each of these programs. And they can be found on the CDE Ombudsman webpage at the link provided. So just to recap, for Titles 2, 3, and 4, funding is based on students enrolled at the eligible private schools within your district boundaries. So for these programs, you will never serve students attending nonprofit private schools outside of your district boundaries. Next slide. So in this next section, we'll be taking a look at the consultation requirements. Next slide. So this slide provides an overview of the consultation process and the components that we'll be taking a deeper look at in this section. Consultation involves ongoing discussions and meetings between public and private school officials on key topics related to the provision of equitable services. And keep in mind that consultation is the responsibility of the district. The goal of consultation is agreement between the district and private school officials on how to provide equitable and effective programs for eligible private school students, teachers, and families. Next slide, please. The first step in the process is identifying eligible private schools. And only nonprofit private schools that have submitted an affidavit to the CDE are eligible to participate. There are two ways to access the list of eligible private schools. The first link on the slide will take you to the CDE website where you can access a list of all private schools with an affidavit on file. The second link is a searchable database that allows a search by district for the private schools within the district boundaries. And a county password is required to access this database. The password for LA County is listed on the slide. However, other counties must contact the CDE private school office for their specific county password. One thing to also keep in mind is that CDE does not verify the accuracy of this information. And so the CDE expects districts to verify the accuracy of student enrollment data and tax exempt status through the consultation process. And again, for Titles 2, 3, and 4, only nonprofit private schools within the district boundaries are eligible to participate. Whereas, as previously mentioned, with Title I, there may be private schools outside of your district boundaries that are eligible to participate. Next slide, please. So once you've identified eligible private schools, you must then contact them to inform them of the programs and services for which their students, teachers, and families may be eligible. And again, consultation with the nonprofit private schools is the district's responsibility. So it's up to the district to initiate this contact with the private schools on an annual basis. It's recommended that LEAs reach out to eligible private schools around January or February to begin consultation early enough to prepare for the next school year. And this is to ensure that there's timely implementation of services. Most LEAs use some sort of invitation letter or an intent to participate letter to initiate this contact. So in this letter, you would include a brief description of the applicable programs that your district participates in. And you may also request that the private school indicates their intent to participate in any or all applicable programs. You would then follow up with an informational meeting regarding the specific programs and the consultation process. If you don't receive a response from private school officials, you should follow up with the private school and also maintain documentation of any attempts to contact them. For example, if you send letters or communication, you want to send it by certified mail, or if you send emails, include a read receipt to document that it was received by the private school official. Next slide, please. So here we see a screenshot of the CDE sample intent to participate letter. And so again, the consultation process is initiated annually when the district reaches out to the private schools to explain the intent and purposes of the applicable federal programs that their students and staff may be eligible to participate. it's important to obtain a copy of the intent to participate form from each private school, and this is whether or not they intend to participate in equitable services. Another tip is that LEAs should also include a deadline by which the private school needs to respond, and also identify any potential consequences for not meeting this deadline. You would then begin the consultation process with the private schools that have indicated their intent to participate. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the intent to participate letter should be followed up with an informational meeting to provide more specific information about the programs that the private school students, teachers, and families may be eligible to participate, as well as the procedures for participating. So some of the topics that could be addressed at the initial meeting are listed on this slide. For example, it will be important to explain the consultation process and the required topics, and that it's about designing an equitable and effective program for eligible students and teachers, and not about the private school sending the district a list of items or services that they wish to obtain. Other possible topics include explaining the purpose of the federal programs available and the services allowed under each program, explaining that the district is responsible for developing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating the programs, providing funding estimates for the next school year, as well as the process used to determine private schools' equitable share, providing information on district policies and procedures, such as contracts and encumbrance deadlines, verifying the name and contact information for the private school official designated to represent the school, and also scheduling future meetings and timelines for consultation. Next slide. So consultation with private school officials must be timely and meaningful, and it must begin early enough to prepare for the next school year. Consultation must occur during the design and the development of programs, and before the district makes any decision that can impact the participation of private school students, teachers, other educational personnel, and families. And it must also be ongoing throughout the year to ensure effective implementation and evaluation of services. ESEA requires districts to address specific topics during consultation, and some of those topics are listed on this slide. Keep in mind that a unilateral offer of services by a district with no opportunity for discussion or the application of a blanket rule is not adequate consultation. Effective consultation provides an opportunity for all parties to express their views and to have those views considered. Next slide, please. So here is a sample private school consultation timeline that has been adapted from a sample CDE timeline. And the link to the CDE sample is included at the bottom of the slide for your reference. If you take a look at February, you'll see that it is suggested that LEAs begin evaluating the current programs and services being provided, and also begin the consultation process for the next year's services. You'll also notice that at certain times during the year, LEAs are consulting with private school officials on both the current year programs and services, and also the next year's programs and services. One other thing to keep in mind is that in the past, the CDE has updated the private school database in March. So if you begin identifying the eligible private schools in January or February for services for the next school year, you'll want to double check the CDE list to see if any new schools were added. Next slide, please. So again, as mentioned, consultation involves ongoing discussions and meetings between public and private school officials on specific topics that are required by ESEA. And so the topics listed on this slide are required for all federal programs. So through consultation, LEAs and private school officials will need to discuss how the private school students' needs will be identified, what services will be offered and how, where, and by whom those services will be provided, how the services will be assessed, and how those results will be used to improve services. Also, the size and scope of services, including the equitable share, and how that amount is determined, and how and when the district will make decisions about the delivery of services. Next slide, please. So here we see additional required consultation topics. And the 3 in the red area are again required for all federal programs. However, the 3 topics in the pink area are only applicable to Title I. So for all programs, consultation will also need to address how disagreements will be addressed in writing. If the LEA disagrees with the private school officials on any topics discussed during consultation, the LEA must provide in writing to the private school official the reasons why it disagrees. Consultation must also address whether the district will provide services directly or through a contract with a third-party provider, and whether to provide equitable services by pooling funds or on a school-by-school basis. It's important to note that the LEA and private school officials must agree to the pooling of funds through consultation, and LEAs may not unilaterally make the decision to pool funds. Now, as mentioned, the last 3 in the pink area only apply to Title I. So for Title I, consultation will also need to address the method that will be used to determine low-income students, when services will be provided, including the approximate time of day, and whether to consolidate Title I equitable services funds with funds available under other programs. Keep in mind that this does not mean that LEAs are able to consolidate funds across programs, but rather coordinate the use of funds to maximize services. Next slide, please. So districts must maintain documentation that verifies that it has met the requirement for timely and meaningful consultation and has provided equitable services. So this documentation includes intent to participate letters, written affirmations, and other evidence of consultation attempts. In order to document your outreach to private schools, you should ensure that any communication mailed, again, is sent via certified mail, and anything emailed should be sent with read receipts. Other documentation that districts must maintain include meeting agendas and minutes, any written explanations of disagreements, data collected to assess or evaluate services, any service agreements or contracts with third-party providers, monitoring and assessment tools, inventory records of any materials, property, or equipment purchased, and the identification criteria for student eligibility for Title I services. Next slide. So here we see a screenshot of the CDE's written affirmation, and the link to access this written affirmation on the CDE website is included on the slide. So LEAs are required to maintain in its records a written affirmation signed by each nonprofit private school to document that timely and meaningful consultation has occurred. Private school officials must also have the option to indicate their belief that timely and meaningful consultation has not occurred, or that the program design for private school participants is not equitable. And this information is reported to the CDE through the nonprofit private school consultation page with the spring CONAP submission in June. Next slide, please. So this is a screenshot of the nonprofit private school consultation page from the spring CONAP submission. And so you can see that LEAs are asked to indicate for each nonprofit private school if consultation has occurred, if consultation agreement was met, if a signed written affirmation is on file, and must also provide a consultation code indicating whether the private school's belief that timely and meaningful consultation has or has not occurred, or if the program design is not equitable. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, designing, implementing, and evaluating the program is the responsibility of the district, but this must also be done in consultation with the private school. And this is where a good working relationship is critical to the development of trust between the LEA and the private school officials. It's also important to ensure timely implementation of programs. And again, this is an LEA responsibility, but it requires working with the private school to make it happen. Once the services have been implemented, it's important to evaluate the effectiveness of the program. And again, this is a district responsibility. So measures to evaluate program effectiveness and any program changes based on the evaluation should be determined in consultation with the private school officials. Next slide, please. So consultation really is key to implementing effective programs. It must be timely and meaningful, take place before the district makes any decisions, and must be ongoing throughout the school year to help ensure effective implementation and the evaluation of services. And again, the goal of all parties should be to reach an agreement, and all agreements should be clear, in writing, and also form the basis of services to be provided and funds to be expended. Effective consultation serves to ensure that the services provided meet the needs of eligible students, teachers, and families. And it also helps to avoid any last-minute spending requests from private schools. And that concludes my section, so I will now turn it over to Amy.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'm just doing a quick time check, and I believe this was scheduled to go to 4:30, and I have 17 slides to present. So if it does by chance go over our time, please know that this is being recorded and we will post it so we'd understand if you have to leave the Zoom meeting, but otherwise feel free to stay on with us. So we're going to go through next a number of key requirements as they relate to the provision of equitable services to eligible nonprofit private schools. Next slide, please. Many of the key requirements that are contained within the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, which is commonly referred to as EDGAR, are found in sections 76.650 through 76.677. And these sections address the private school requirements. We'll go through each of these that are on the slide and point out a few red flags along the way. Next slide. So the first area that we're going to look at is district responsibilities. And we can see where some of the red flags might be here. This section of EDGAR says that the district should provide a genuine opportunity for equitable services, which is often initiated with the notification to eligible private schools, which Rachel just discussed. Then we identify eligible schools, contact them, and obtain the intent to participate. This section also addresses the district's responsibility to develop a program based on the numbers of students and the needs of students. And it also clearly indicates that the program development and administration is a district responsibility. Next slide. A large component in the development of the program is accomplished through consultation. As Rachel said, consultation is key. She went over specific topics to be discussed, as well as the documentation required. And this slide summarizes those key requirements that are found in EDGAR. Next slide, please. So next we have the section of EDGAR, which requires that districts determine services based on the needs of students, the number of students, and benefits. While services may not be the same as those offered in public schools, they must be comparable. In section 76.653, they describe it as comparable in quality, scope, and opportunity, and that if the needs of the private school students are different from those of eligible private school students, if the needs of private school students are different from those of public school students, then the district shall provide benefits that are different. Next slide. And as we heard from Adrian, the determination of Title I funding and eligibility for services is different from the other Titles 2, 3, and 4. And that can be very confusing in some cases. So we caution districts on using the appropriate selection criteria for student participation in Title I programs at their private school. So these are a few examples of red flags that we might see. So first, using free and reduced lunch eligibility for student identification is not allowed. Poverty is not a criteria for services. It just helps to determine the generation, how to generate the allocation. Secondly, including any students at the private school for services is not appropriate. So only private school students that reside in Title I attendance areas that are eligible for services at private schools should be receiving services. So it operates much like the targeted assistance school scenario. And third, using a single cut score or data point for eligibility for services is another inappropriate practice. Eligibility for services must be based on multiple educationally related objective criteria and agreed to in consultation. For example, using only teacher judgment in grades where other assessment data is available would be inappropriate. Next slide, please. In EDGAR section 76.655, it states that the district shall spend the same average amount of program funds on a student in a private school as a student in a public school. But services are based on consultation, and therefore the section also allows for a different average amount relative to the needs of private school students. If meeting the needs of private school students is different from the costs of meeting the needs of public school students, and because those needs are different, then the average program funds per student may in fact be different. So it just has that, it allows for that difference. Next slide. Here we're going to begin talking about district control of program and district control of funds. Highlighted in yellow there, you might also hear the phrase public control of funds. Control over equipment and supplies can become problematic for many reasons, including the requirement that these materials and supplies are, quote, not to benefit the private school. And that's found in section 76.658. And it states that program funds are not to be used to finance the existing level of instruction or to otherwise benefit the private school. Instead, the funds are to meet the specific needs of eligible students. Again, not the needs of the private school or general needs of the students. So when through consultation, the need for certain equipment or supplies are determined, how do you ensure that administrative control? The district should purchase the items. They should be labeled and inventoried. They are property of the district and not the private school. If the equipment or materials being purchased are needed for a Title I program at that private school, how might you ensure that they're used only with those Title I students? So these are some of the controls or safeguards for use that would need to be implemented. In addition, remember that items purchased are not permanent fixtures to the private school. They must be removable without remodeling. as they should be able to be removed when the program is no longer in place or no longer needed. One of the things to be careful of with equipment is that the longer the item is at the private school, the items begin to feel like they belong to the private school. So one practice that districts might consider is to pull the items in for inventory at the end of each school year so that they do not just sit at the private school year after year. Then upon consultation for the new year, it can be determined whether that same equipment is necessary for the planned program for eligible students. Next slide. Another aspect related to control of funds is the use of personnel to implement programs. If private school personnel will be involved in the implementation of programs, there's a few key things to remember. This is the district's program, even if you're using private school teachers. And therefore, the services performed should be under the supervision of the district, meaning the program should be monitored and involve program visits. Through consultation, the plan for use of private school personnel should clearly define the contract for services and ensure that the program and any related PD is outside the regular hours of the private school staff members' regular duties, because the funds cannot be used to finance the existing level of instruction, as we saw in that previous slide. In addition, the contract should be in line with district procedures and policies. So you wouldn't want to be funding a private school teacher who would have been funded otherwise through private school funds, and it should, so that therefore it should be really outside of their regular duty. If the plan is to use public school personnel from your district, the services being provided should again be supplemental to core instruction and for eligible students only, agreed upon through the consultation process. Next slide, please. There are some important fiscal control reminders related to staff implementing programs. Private school teachers hired should be working outside regular duty hours, again, because the program cannot be used to finance existing services, and substitutes cannot be funded because the sub would be providing services for the benefit of the entire class, which would be the benefit of the school and not to the specific eligible students. With workshops and conferences, the district may reimburse the employee directly, but can never reimburse the private school directly. Also for payment to private school staff attending PD, if the school would, through consultation, like to pay a stipend for the teachers attending that PD outside their regular hours, again, that stipend needs to be paid directly to the teacher and never directly to the private school. Next slide. As for contracts, the key thing here is to remember is that the contract details should be worked out through consultation and aligned to your district policies and procedures, such as when contracting with a third party, you'd begin with an RFA, include monitoring and expected outcomes to measure for effectiveness, have deliverables and due dates. Oftentimes, third-party providers may try to promote their programs directly with the private school. So the district really needs to be a part of that process of determining whether those services of the third-party provider are what is necessary to meet the needs of eligible students. So we shouldn't have private schools determining which vendors they'd like to use, but it really should be in consultation together. Next slide. We have some red flags here. What are some red flags that might signal a lack of district control? We know the LEA must always maintain control of the funds and programs, and that those programs must be designed through consultation with the private school. So let's take a look at some of those red flags that might signal the lack of district control. If, for one example, if private school officials are signing the timesheets, this might be a red flag, because if the LEA is not maintaining their legal oversight for the services being delivered as planned through consultation. So while private school official may sign it, there also should be some way for the public school supervisor, public district supervisor also to be supervising and managing their time. If contractors are determining services that are going to be provided, this would be another red flag because it does not indicate district control. All services to be provided, whether by district employees or through employees contracted by the LEA, to implement a specific program need to be developed through consultation. So outside contractors should not be the ones who determine the programs to be provided or the areas to be addressed and then charge the district for services. Should be all part of the consultation process and predetermined. Similarly, red flags would apply if private school officials are telling the LEA that they arranged for PD and are now sending an invoice. So if this ever happens, if there was no discussion during consultation prior to that PD, then this would signal that the PD was not provided as part of a program plan that was designed through consultation and was likely not addressing a specific objective that was developed through that consultation process, and therefore not allocable to the intent and purpose of the program. So really got to watch out for any PD that was not discussed in advance through that consultation process. Likewise, budgets and purchase orders submitted to the district from the private school officials are problematic, as they may not reflect consultation if they do not reflect consultation for program development and related services. So sending invoices to the LEA makes it apparent that the district is not maintaining control of funds. It, again, should be something that is part of the program plan. Next slide. Allowable uses. We're talking here next about funds not to benefit private school in section 76.658. I know we talked about this a little earlier, but it is a key requirement in EDGAR that funds cannot benefit the private school. Funding is not for general use for the school. Funding may not finance the existing level of instruction in private schools or otherwise benefit the school itself. Allowable uses must be agreed upon and support program implementation, including specific strategies to support eligible students to achieve academic outcomes that are determined through consultation. In order to plan appropriate services, it would require an understanding of the existing level of instruction or the private school's core program. So we want to ask what instruction, including those in place for English learners, what services, equipment, materials, and professional development are already in place. And then based on the needs of eligible private school students, what services might these federal program funds what might be implemented to best meet their needs. If purchasing equipment or materials, these should not be intended to the benefit of the entire school, but only for programs for those eligible students. Therefore, the district, in consultation with the private school, would discuss controls for unauthorized use. Next slide. Now let's consider a few problematic situations where use of funds would provide benefit overall to the private school and not specifically support the academic needs identified and the corresponding program developed through consultation to address those needs. For instance, purchase of general items for general use at a private school, such as library books, whiteboards for classroom use, computers and software placed in classrooms, provides an overall benefit to all of the students in the school, which is not an allowable use of Title I funds. Additionally, additional red flags include using Title I funds at private schools for general instructional or curricular, Title I or Title III, if it's for general instructional or curricular workshops, or for general data analysis training for all teachers, or for providing general courses leading to teaching certification. In all of these instances, the actions would benefit the entire school or entire classroom without regard for eligibility for services. Such uses of title funds would clearly not focus on the targeted program designed through consultation to address the very specific needs of those students at the private school, and they would benefit the entire school and therefore not allowed. Even when considering other title funds such as Title II and IV, where services are not as strictly tied to student eligibility factors such as academic needs or the English learner needs in Title I and III, the actions and services still must be determined through consultation to meet the needs of students and not to benefit the private school. It is acknowledged in EDGAR, however, that a benefit to students may also benefit to the school, but the focus always needs to be primarily on the students. An example of this might be for a request for professional development with Title II, where a private school, for example, might say, oh, can we perhaps send an administrator to a workshop that focuses on branding and marketing the private school? And where that is a professional development session, where it would not be allowable is it would appear to benefit the needs of the school and not the specific needs of the student. So that's kind of a good example of where there may be a workshop available, but Title II would not be would not be an appropriate use of title funds because it is not focused on the needs of students and instead intending to benefit the needs of the overall school. Next slide, please. So once all services are planned through consultation, there's a requirement for districts to conduct program evaluation. And often there is no program evaluation of equitable services in private schools. And if the LEA finds that a program is not effective, they have a responsibility to change it, even if the private school finds some benefit or likes it, because the obligation is really to the students. The lack of program evaluation can definitely be a red flag. Consultation that does not develop and include the process and the metrics that will be used for evaluation to reflect on program implementation and effectiveness can be a sign that the district's not prepared or intending to evaluate the district's the programs as required. Additionally, if there are no measurable benchmarks included and agreed upon when designing the program evaluation during consultation, it wouldn't be clear what data the LEA plans to use and how the LEA plans to analyze the results to inform the LEA and private school community about the impact of the strategies that are being used, and there would be no information available or data available to determine how we might modify or improve the program for the following year. So just as we do in public schools, program evaluation is important as it should impact the decisions for how services are planned in the following year. Also, when data for program evaluation is limited to only collecting pre and post-test scores and does not include multiple measures and a process to reflect on multiple data sources, program implementation, then it doesn't always support the required purposeful program evaluation. Next slide, please. Just a couple last slides on key requirements. Bypass is another section included in EDGAR, and it's actually EDGAR section 76.670 through 76.677. So there's quite a few sections there. And this says that the state must provide equitable services directly to the private school if the private school requests it and is able to demonstrate that LEA has not met its legal requirements. There's a process for this and a hearing to show cause for action. The first step, though, is always going to be for the private school to contact the state's ombudsman to seek resolution for a complaint. There's some more information on this in the 2019 non-regulatory guidance, and so that's linked here. Next slide. Other fiscal requirements. So under ESSA, the LEA can charge reasonable and necessary administrative costs, and that's still subject to the 15% limit. And because equitable share is taken off the top of the total allocation, an LEA may reserve funds from the proportionate share, an amount that's reasonable and necessary to administer the program. So that should be part of consultation. I know that we're getting late here, and we will be working on posting this recording probably for sure by Monday, but usually we'll try to do it within the next couple days. I just saw that in the chat, so I thought I'd mention it. For the question of carryover, that's the next bullet on the slide. ESSA requires the LEA to obligate funds for equitable services in the year for which they are appropriated. The process of consultation should ensure throughout the year that the intended plan is progressing and limit situations in which funds are left unspent. And according to federal guidance, there may be extenuating circumstances in which the LEA is unable to obligate all funds, then funds may be used for equitable services in the following year, subject to consultation. And that also is in the federal non-regulatory guidance, which might be a good place to review those extenuating circumstances examples. Supplement, not supplant. As discussed earlier, services cannot take the place of, cannot benefit the school. And this applies to, so that the general idea is that services cannot replace or finance the existing level of instruction at the school, basic services. With transferability, the next bullet, the key idea here is that the district must consult with private schools before making any decisions to transfer funds. And the last bullet on interagency agreement, again, these are just some little fiscal requirements, reminders. Because Title I Part A eligible students may attend private schools in adjoining districts, the LEA of residence may arrange to have services provided by another LEA. If the LEA makes such an arrangement with another LEA, the two LEAs must establish an interagency agreement which spells out the details of the reimbursement, indicating the per pupil amounts for the number of children served. The LEA of residence must then reimburse the LEA that provides Title I services at the per pupil amount rate in the participating school attendance area of the child's residence. So this would be in the case that two LEAs kind of work out that agreement for one to provide services. Next slide. Last slide, actually. So this is the little things that count, kind of lastly, the few little things that can make a big difference. First, we wanted to address the language we use around equitable services. The language we use can make a big difference in the perception of both public and private school officials engaged in this work. And while there might be a tendency to say things like that's the private school's program or the private school hasn't spent their funds, changing that language instead to something like these are the services that we have planned for private school students and teachers helps to underscore the importance of consultation and district control over programs. Instead of referring to, quote, the private school's materials and equipment, public school and private school officials should refer to materials as being on loan from the district to support the services to eligible private school students. So the table is kind of giving us the do's and don'ts of phrases that we might be using. And the reason for this on loan scenario, on loan language is because once those materials are no longer needed, or the services of the number of eligible students changes, the materials and equipment would need to be returned to the district. So they are in effect really on loan. And instead of saying it's the private school's contractor, we would want to reframe that as services being provided to eligible students based on their identified needs. So language can really shift the way we understand equitable services. Also, this final slide offers us a reminder of the importance of those initial meetings, which can really set the tone for the year. It's important to set clear policies and procedures, including how consultation will be used to hear the needs of the private school and come to agreement on their plans for implementing and evaluating programs. Many of you have established great professional working relationships with your private schools, and that in the end can make all the difference by establishing that trust so that the focus is first and foremost on serving the students. And that concludes our presentation. We again thank you for joining us, and we want to thank you for your questions in the chat. If there are any left unanswered, we will be including those in our follow-up Q&A. We'll be preparing those responses and send those out, as well as posting the recording of this workshop. Our contact information is also on the next slide. And as always, we encourage you to reach out with any questions or support if needed. We'll leave the chat open for a few more minutes for any last minute questions, but otherwise we thank you and we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.